Well, good morning, or perhaps good afternoon to our colleagues on the East Coast who are joining us for this second UForum webinar. My name is Jim Hurrell, and I'm Director of the National Center for Atmospheric Research here in Boulder, Colorado. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to what I promise will be an extremely interesting and informative discussion. Very briefly, before I introduce today's speaker, UForum is a webinar series intended to focus on issues and topics in the atmospheric and Earth system sciences that are of interest to the UCAR community. UForum is a response to the message that UCAR President Tom Bogdan has received in his visits to UCAR member universities, namely to help bring the community together in discussions with leaders working at the frontiers of our science. 2 days ago, we did just that with the inaugural UForum webinar, which was given by NCAR senior scientist Jerry Meal on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, History and Process of Producing Climate Science Assessments. And today, it is a real pleasure to introduce another outstanding leader in the field, as well as, I can attest personally, a very captivating speaker, and that is Professor Tony Leiserowitz from Yale University, where he is a research scientist and director of the Yale Project on Climate Change Communication. Tony is a widely recognized expert on American and international public opinion on global warming, including public perception of climate change risks, support and opposition for climate policies, and willingness to make individual behavioral change. His research investigates the psychological, cultural, political, and geographic factors that drive public environmental perception and behavior. And today, so we are very pleased that Tony can join us in discussing the challenges, the lessons learned, and perspectives gained from his experiences in communicating climate change science in the U.S. Before I turn it over to Tony, I only wish to note that he has graciously agreed to take questions after this talk, and Bob Henson from UCAR Communications will moderate that portion of the webinar. Instructions on how to submit questions are available on the UForum website, which can easily be found off to the right of the main UCAR homepage, which is www.ucar.edu. So without further ado, Tony, thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you all for inviting me. So let me show my screen. And please let me know, are we okay?
We are okay.
Great. All right. Well, thank you very much. It's really a great pleasure to be here. Thank you to UCAR and NCAR for inviting me to join you today. As you know, this is a very exciting and important time in public discussions about climate change, not just because of the issue and as the science continues to advance, but now we have one of those important moments, which is the release of the next IPCC report, which is going to generate a fair amount of media coverage and, of course, just increasing public attention to this issue, as well as policymakers. So this really is a great opportunity for the scientific community to really engage with, ultimately the stakeholders of the society in dealing with this issue. So let me give you a little more background about who we are at the Yale Project on Climate Change Communication. So our main interest is trying to figure out what do people understand and misunderstand about the causes and the consequences and the potential solutions to climate change. How do they perceive the risks? So the likelihood and the severity of specific kinds of impacts, whether that be fires or floods or severe storms and so on. We also look at whether they support policy or not, and then what kinds of behaviors are they engaged in around climate and energy, and what behaviors are they willing to change? What are the barriers that prevent them from changing behavior? And then, as was described before, our ultimate question then as scientists is why? What are the underlying psychological, cultural, political reasons why some people get really engaged with this issue, other people are apathetic, and other people are dismissive or basically hostile towards the issue? So we look at this then at many, many different scales. here I'll talk about the national scale, what's going on in the United States as a whole. But we've been doing a lot of work and are going to do much more work at the state and local level. In fact, we've just released a series of reports, which some of you may have seen in Colorado, in California. We just released an Ohio report. We'll be releasing a report on Texas next week. But we also work at the global scale as well. So we've just done major studies in China, in India, and with about 130 plus countries around the world with the Gallup World Poll. So we look at this issue at many, many different scales. The issue of public engagement and awareness is different depending on where you look. So while I'm going to talk about what's going on here at the national scale in this talk, by all means in the Q&A and in discussion, if people have other questions, please let me know. Okay, so let me begin with a basic fantasy, and that is, you know, wouldn't it be great if every American could have the equivalent of Climate Change 101? Where they got a good basic undergraduate level introduction to the causes, the consequences, and the potential solutions to climate change, as well as just how the climate system actually works. Problem is that's never, ever going to happen. Now, I'm, by the way, not saying that we should just simply treat all people as if they don't want to know all these details. In fact, there is a large minority of people who are very interested in the science. And in fact, they are actively seeking out more information about the science. And we as a community need to do all we can to meet them more than halfway in giving them the answers to the questions that they want, which are great and legitimate questions. However, that's not most Americans. Most Americans, you know, they have incredibly busy lives. They're reading the news, and the news is telling them about all kinds of other issues besides climate change, whether that be Syria or, you know, the latest scandals or what have you. So climate change for most people is a relatively small part of their information diet, let's say. And as a result, there's relatively limited shelf space in most people's heads for this issue. So the challenge I would like to put forward to the community is really, let's just assume for a moment that you've only got enough room in most people's heads for about 5 key ideas that you want them to understand about climate change and climate science. So the challenge is, the question is, what 5 things would you want them to understand? Now, the answer to that question is obviously going to differ depending on who exactly you're talking about. If it's a water utility manager, well, clearly they need some much more specialized kind of knowledge. But if we're talking about the broad public, I would argue that you want ideas that are big ideas, ideas that aren't only going to help them understand this issue today, but are going to be incredibly helpful in allowing them to make good inferences about this issue for years and years to come. Because as we all know, this is not an issue of the here of the moment. This is an issue that Americans and policymakers are going to have to come back to again and again and again and again, literally for decades. So what we have been doing in our research and some of our other colleagues around the country has been trying to answer that question. What key 5 ideas might you want to really focus on? And here's our best answer to that today. And we basically have gotten it down to 10 words. Actually, a friend of mine in Congress has even turned this into a haiku, but I won't give you that version. And it's quite basic. These are very straightforward, simple concepts, and yet they can be instantiated. They can be described in hundreds and hundreds of ways. So think of these not as just simple facts, but as meta ideas. First of all, it's real. Okay? Climate change is happening. Secondly, it's us this time. Yes, climate has changed over millennia and millions of years in the past, but this time is different. This time is primarily because of human activity. Third, it's bad. It's bad now, and it's going to get much, much worse if we continue on the current path. Fourth, and I'll say a lot more about this in a moment, scientists agree. This is a critical belief and understanding for most people, and I'll come back to it in a moment. And then last but not least, there's hope, that there are solutions in hand, that we aren't just simply giving people an explanation of just how, what this problem is and what the threat is, but that there are things that we can do as individuals and collectively as a society to effectively address this challenge. And that's it. Now, these are very straightforward and simple ideas, but each one of them, of course, can be described and provided with lots and lots of evidence. So, the idea that it's real. You can come up with hundreds of examples of how we know that it's real. Here's all the different ways that the scientific community has determined that this is actually happening. Likewise, that it's us. Here's all the different ways that we know that that's true. That it's bad. Here we can go into all the different kinds of impacts that are likely to happen. But what I'm saying is that as you go through each of those examples, all you're trying to do, or you should be trying to do, is to build this meta idea in most people's heads, because these are the basic concepts that they can then use from then on, again, for years to come. So I would argue that by contrast, having people know exactly what the parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere is today is probably not a critical piece of information for most people compared to these basic ideas. And last I'll just say is that this, I think, basic kind of framework should be useful for all of us, no matter what level of climate scientists that we are. That even when you're giving a presentation about, the latest permutation and the latest, cutting-edge finding, that it's always good to come back to these core principles that people understand that even though we as a community may be debating about some very specific aspect of this, we actually all do agree about the fundamentals, and these are the fundamentals. And I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. Okay, so how are we doing right now? If we were to use these basic concepts as an indicator, as a set of critical indicators for public understanding and engagement with the issue, how are we doing? So this slide right here is where I pulled together all the survey data that's been collected by different organizations that have asked a version of the question, is global warming happening repeatedly, again and again over time, so we can see the trend. And now they ask this question in different ways with different wording, and so they come up with different estimates. But that's not really the important thing that I want you to look at here. What I want you to look at is the trend. And basically what we see in all of them is that there was a surge in public engagement and interest in this issue in about 2005, 6, reaching a high water mark in 2007. And then in 2008, it started to drop, and it dropped pretty dramatically. Across all of these different surveys, it was about a 14 percentage point drop, bottoming out in 2010. And since then, it's been starting to come back up. Not back up to where we were in 2007, but on the rise. And of course, depending on which of these estimates you look at, our own data as of last April had about 63% of Americans who understood that global warming is happening, suggesting that, again, about 37% have not yet even been convinced of that basic fact. Okay. But we see these same kind of patterns in other key measures as well. Only about half of Americans understand that global warming is mostly human caused. And this is, again, showing our own results from 2008 all the way up to April of 2013, so just a few months ago. And as of last April, only 49% of Americans understood this basic fact, that global warming is mostly caused by human activities. So there's still an awful lot of confusion out there. And then back to this crucial key understanding. As of our last survey, again in April, only 42% of Americans understand that most scientists think global warming is happening. Now note this question is not asking, do scientists agree that it's human caused? This question does not ask, do most scientists think that global warming is bad and that there's serious threat? No, this is just simply asking the question, do they think the world is actually warming? And only 4 out of 10 Americans understand that there is a consensus about this. And this is just very loosely phrased as most scientists. Okay? And in fact, when we've done subsequent, more precise studies, we find that only 13% of Americans can correctly identify the right quintile. In other words, that more than 80% of climate scientists agree that global warming is happening. Now, this happens to be one of those facts about which there is really no disagreement. I mean, even most of the so-called skeptic scientists usually accept the basic fact that the world is actually warming. They may say it's not human caused or that it's not a serious problem and so on, but very few even doubt this basic fact. And yet most Americans don't understand this. Now this is critical because in our research we've identified this as what we call a gateway belief. Okay? That in fact, numerous studies using different approaches have determined that more than 9 out of 10 experts agree that human-caused climate change is happening. That's either through reviewing the literature, the peer-reviewed literature itself, or actually surveying working scientists. But what we have found in our survey research is that this is a critical gateway belief. That the more people understand that the experts agree, the more they in turn believe themselves that climate change is real, that it's human caused, that it's bad for people, that it is in fact solvable, and in turn they become more supportive of action by political leaders and more action by everyone, including citizens themselves. Now, it's not perhaps totally surprising that 4 out of 10 people don't yet understand this. Of course, this has been a key strategy of the opponents of climate action, is to cast doubt on the reality or on the fact that most of the experts agree. This is actually a strategy that was lifted directly out of the tobacco wars. It's been very well documented. And that strategy was just basically keep convincing the public that the scientists are still arguing over even the reality of this problem. And as long as people still believe that they're still arguing about it, they will not support serious action. And it makes perfect sense, again, from the position of a layperson. As a layperson, I don't know climate scientists personally. I certainly don't read the peer-reviewed literature. I certainly don't read the IPCC reports. And if my impression, through what I'm seeing in the media in particular, is that the experts, the people who study this day in and day out, day after day, are still arguing with each other over whether this problem even exists, I mean, of course, my natural tendency is to say, you know what, I'm not going to take this very seriously because once the experts figure it out, they're going to tell me, and then I'll take it more seriously. Not recognizing, of course, that in fact the experts have agreed. They have reached this level of widespread, nearly unanimous agreement, and in fact have even said so. But just because the fact that you put out a press release, or you put it on a website, or you publish an article, or something like that, does not mean that most people have ever heard this basic fact. Okay? So that's the difference between having said it once and having it actually cut through all the noise that's out there, all the other things that people are being bombarded with, all the other information. That doesn't mean this particular message has gotten through. So I would ask that, you know, those scientists that are going to engage the public through op-eds, through lectures, through presentations, through stakeholder meetings, and so on, keep coming back to these 5 key ideas, and in particular this one, to help people understand that, in fact, there is no debate about these basic facts. Plenty of debate about some of the other details, like, you know, when specific kinds of events will hit certain places and by what time. Sure, lots of debate about that. But these basic fundamentals are really not in debate. Let's see. And what we also see is that very few Americans are very worried about global warming. As of last April, only 14% said that they were very worried about this issue, and only just slightly over half say that they're worried really at all. Now, why is that? So this has been one of the oldest and longstanding findings in our research, and that is that many people continue to think of climate change as a distant problem. Distant in time, that the impacts won't be felt for a generation or more. And distant in space. This is about polar bears, small island countries, maybe developing countries like Bangladesh, but not the United States, not my state, not my community, not my friends and family, or any of the people and places that I care about. So, okay, maybe it's happening, but if so, it's distant. It's far away. It's certainly not something I should prioritize. And that's, in fact, exactly what we see in measures of public priorities. Here is research data from the Pew Research Center, where every year they ask what should be the top priorities for President and the Congress. This is as of 2013, so just a few months ago. And what we see here is what we've always seen. Climate change is always at or near the bottom of this list of national priorities. As of last, I think this was March, 28% of people said this should be a top priority. Now, it's on the list, so let's first of all recognize that's an incredible accomplishment in and of itself. There are plenty of issues that are not on this list. That said, it is clearly at the bottom of a long list of other issues that they want their elected officials to take action on. And moreover, back to that declining trend that I was talking about before, it's been a 10-point drop since 2007 on climate change. The environment as a category dropped 5 points, energy as an issue dropped 12 points, and so on, whereas you can see that issues like the economy, jobs, and the budget deficit have soared to the very top of public priorities. Okay, so why these declines? Well, we think that there's a whole bunch of things going on, and we're actually doing a very intense study right now to really try to unpack this and figure out which of these has the greatest role. But we know a number of things happened in this time period, this critical time period from 2007 to 2010. First of all, obviously, the economy. 2008 is when the housing bubble burst. It's when the financial crisis hit. Unemployment surges up over 10%. Unemployment and jobs and the economy soar to the top of that national priority list I just showed you, and with obvious reasons. You know, if you're lost your job or you're afraid of losing your job, you're afraid of what's happening in the economy, your house is suddenly underwater, and so on. Of course, these are direct, immediate, in your environment, in some cases directly visceral threats. So of course it's no surprise. But what's less understood is that there was an attendant major decline in media coverage of climate change in the same time period. Max Boykoff at University of Colorado tracked newspaper coverage. He found that coverage dropped by about 2/3. Bob Rule tracked nightly network news coverage. He's at Drexel University. He found that it dropped by about 90%, so ABC News, CBS Evening News, etc. Okay, now this is an issue that all of us know. We can look out the window right this moment, and there's CO2 pouring out of smokestacks, pouring out of buildings, pouring out of tailpipes, but you can't see it. And in fact, everybody watching this seminar, there's CO2 pouring out of each of us. And until I said it, you weren't even thinking of it. You weren't even conscious of it. That's because it's invisible. For most of us, most people, climate change and the causes of climate change are completely invisible. And likewise, the impacts are largely invisible to most of us until we've been shown or told where to look. And in fact, as I said before, most people don't know scientists. They don't read the literature. So the main way that the vast majority of people even know about this issue is through the mass media. And when the media doesn't report this issue, it's literally out of sight and out of mind. So this was certainly a major shift in that time period. We also had some unusually cold weather in 2009 and 10, and I always get these backwards, but first there was Snowmageddon and then Snowpocalypse. We're running out of these kinds of apocalyptic terminology for these events. But we know that some people who don't know much about climate change, who don't already have strong opinions about climate change, will draw on their personal experience or what they see playing out on the television screen to make up their mind about this issue, whether it's even happening. And so we suspect, and we've shown in other research, as has others, that just most recent experience of a hot day or a cold day or a snowstorm can actually influence some of these people's opinions. I also mentioned this before. We had an effective denial industry, which has, again, been very well documented, that really kicked into overdrive in this time period, and that's because there was real legislation starting to work its way through Congress. The Waxman-Markey bill, which passed the House and was then considered by the Senate. This was no longer an abstract fight over science. This was a real policy fight. And those that are very happy with the status quo really went into overdrive to try to derail that, and to a large extent, pretty successfully. ClimateGate happened in this time period, and I don't need to describe what that was to most of you, other than to say that in our research we found that it had a significant impact. About 12% of Americans either became less convinced that climate change is happening or lost trust in climate scientists. Now, climate scientists are by far the most trusted messengers in America of all the other types of sources that we've tested. Really overwhelming. So I don't mean to say that suddenly people lost trust in climate scientists, but they at least a substantial number of people lost some of their trust in climate scientists. And in particular, that effect was not universally spread throughout American culture and society. It was highly concentrated among conservatives, Republicans, and people who tend to get their news and information from, you probably guessed, Fox, Rush Limbaugh, etc. And in fact, when we went back and did media analysis, we find that, in fact, yes, the CBS Evening News, the NBC News, and New York Times did a story or two about ClimateGate. But it was Fox and Rush where this story came up again and again and again, and always with a very sinister interpretation that scientists were basically making up data and that climate change is essentially a hoax. Okay, last but not least, and just an important context, is the incredibly political polarization that has grown up around this issue. I mean, it was only 1997, when Democrats and Republicans were not very far apart on this issue, actually. It was not a partisan issue. But since 1997, the two parties have gotten farther and farther and farther apart until we are in today's context where climate denial basically has become an article of faith among some in one of the two major parties. And it's become part of identity politics, political identity. And that clearly influences the broader social context in which we as a community try to do our work. Okay. But then, of course, we're not stuck at the bottom in 2010. Things have been coming back since then. So why? What's going on there? Well, first of all, the economy and unemployment are improving. So we have more ability as a society to focus on some of those other issues. There's also been increasing media coverage over the past couple of years, and in no small part that's because we've just undergone two incredible record-setting years of extreme weather events. And I don't need to belabor that, but 2011, I think we had 14 individual events that cost the nation at least $1 billion for a total of something on the order of $54 billion worth of damage. Followed by the subsequent year, which had a whole long string of extreme weather events, including, with a real exclamation point, Hurricane Sandy. So these kinds of events are now happening, and in our research we know that 8 out of 10 Americans say that they have personally experienced one of these extreme weather events, and a third say that they've been harmed in some way, either physically, financially, etc., by one or more of these events. So people are absolutely recognizing what's going on around them. And what we're finding is that many people are connecting the dots themselves. And in fact, they were connecting the dots between their experience and this issue of climate change long before the scientific community really had begun to say, actually, through attribution studies, we're increasingly confident that we can link climate change to some of these events. For many years, scientists would only say the standard talking point, which is that you can never say that any one event was caused by climate change. Jerry Neal, and I hope he talked about this the other day, is really one of the pioneers, along with a number of other scientists, who really said, wait a second, that's the wrong way to think about this. And this is where you probably have all heard the steroids metaphor. This is really about juicing the climate system that makes these kinds of events either more frequent or more severe when they happen. That's, I think, a much more productive and useful way for people to understand, here's how climate change is affecting us today and how it's going to increasingly affect us in the future. So what we see, and again, this data is as of April, 58% of Americans think that global warming is already affecting weather in the United States. And moreover, many of them are even saying that global warming has made several extreme weather events more severe. Now, this is April, so we only showed these. In previous surveys, we found other extreme events were also being linked. But here, as of April, half the country thinks that the fact that 2012 was the warmest year on record in the United States was probably made worse by climate change. The ongoing drought in the Midwest and the Great Plains, Superstorm Sandy, the massive winter snowstorm that hit us here in New England last year. Again, substantial numbers of Americans who themselves are already connecting the dots. Now, this is really important because these events do not, in and of themselves, suddenly convince people. It's not like somebody who, is deeply dismissive of climate change suddenly has the experience of the drought in the Midwest and suddenly goes, okay, now I'm convinced. I mean, some people do, but many people don't. But what this does do is that it provides a teachable moment. It provides a moment when people are actually now paying attention to something that has a direct relationship to climate change. unlike all the other times of our lives where most of us are focused on, putting food on the table, getting our kids to school, taking care of our, elderly parents, paying attention to our favorite TV shows, etc. Okay, most of the time we're not thinking about climate change. Extreme weather happens to be a conversation starter. It's a way to engage people in the conversation because they're already thinking about it, and in fact, many of them are already asking the question: does this have something to do with climate change? And that's really one of those rare golden opportunities for us in our community to say, yeah, let me tell you more about climate change. Okay, one of the other things that we very quickly learned in our research is that Americans don't speak with a single voice on this issue, or any important issue for that matter. And in our work, we've identified what we call global warming 6 Americas, that you can divide the American population into these 6 different groups that each start from a very different place in their engagement with this issue. Many of you probably have seen this, so I won't spend a lot of time here, but just to quickly remind you of what these different groups are. First is the group we call the alarmed. As of April, it was 16% of the public. These are people who think it's happening, it's human caused, it's a serious and urgent threat. They're very eager to take action, but critically, they don't know what that action is. This is by far, and I'll show it in a moment, their major questions. What can I do? What can we do collectively? And that's a crucial question to answer. Moreover, many of them don't recognize that they are part of a group that is 16% of the public. That's a very powerful potential issue public, we would say, except that they're not organized. They're not organized in the way of other issue publics we know, like the pro- or anti-immigration movement or the pro-choice or anti-abortion movement, so on and so forth. Those are actually very well organized by contrast. Many of these people feel relatively isolated and alone. They say, I feel this strongly. Some of my friends and family feel this strongly, but they don't have an understanding that on the order of 45 million other Americans feel as strongly about this issue as they do. Then comes a group we call the concerned. There's about a quarter, 26%. People who think it's happening, human caused, serious, but again, they tend to think of it as distant. Distant in time, we won't feel the impacts for generations, distant in space. This is, again, about polar bears and faraway places, not us. So, yeah, they do want action, they do support action, but they don't see it as urgent, they don't see it as a high priority. Then comes a group we call the cautious, another quarter of the public, and they're kind of paying attention, but really haven't made up their mind yet. Is it happening or not? Is it human? Is it natural? Is it a serious risk, or is it kind of overblown? Just haven't really made up their mind. So they are actively the most open on this and looking for additional information. Then a group we call the disengaged. These are people who have heard the term global warming but know nothing about it. Over and over they just say, I don't know anything about the causes, I don't know anything about the impacts, I don't know anything about the potential solutions. So for them, basic awareness is really the primary barrier that they face. Then comes a group that we call the doubtful. These are people who say, I don't think it's happening, but if it is, it's natural. Nothing that we had anything to do with, nothing we can do anything about. So I don't see it as much of a risk. I don't really pay that much attention to the issue, but my predisposition is to think this is not a serious issue. And then last but not least are those we call the dismissive, 13% as of last April. And these are people who are firmly convinced it's not happening, it's not human caused, it's not a serious problem. And further, many of them are what we lovingly call conspiracy theorists. They say it's hoax, it's scientists making up data, it's the UN trying to take away American sovereignty, it's Al Gore and his friends trying to get rich, and many, many other variants of those kinds of conspiracies. Now note that that is only 13%. And let me say that again. The dismissive are only 13% of the American population, but they're a really loud 13%. They're a really vocal 13%. They tend to dominate the public square. In fact, when we do studies of the comments section on articles about climate change, say in USA Today Online, you'll see that half or more of the comments can be coming from people who are basically dismissing the reality or the seriousness of climate change. So it's really easy as a layperson, as a journalist, as a policymaker, to come away with the false impression that this point of view is half or more of the country. It's not. It's only 13%. But again, they're a pretty effective 13% because they're vocal. All right, and then just to underscore the point that there are just completely different conversations happening in this country all at the same time, is when we've asked Americans, if you could ask an expert on global warming one question, which question would you ask? The doubtful and dismissive, their number one question is, how do you know that global warming is happening or human caused? And on a deeper level, the question really is, and why should I trust you? Whereas the middle groups are, okay, maybe it's happening, but so what? What harm will it cause? Why should I care? And then on the left here, we've got the alarmed and the concerned who are like, okay, I'm with you. I'm convinced it's happening, it's human caused, it's serious, but what can we do about this issue? And critically, we're beginning to see, this isn't a dominant theme by any means yet, but it's starting to creep in, the question, and is it too late? Okay, and that's a really dangerous belief that not only is inaccurate, but it's enormously disempowering. This is why, as a community, we need to do a far better job of helping people understand that there are, in fact, solutions in hand, many of which are already ready to go. They're not only deployable, they are being deployed to great success, and in some cases, even net profit. Yet there are still things that are going to need to be done, new technologies that will need to be developed, new practices, new policies that aren't going to be easy, but that this is, in fact, doable. Very important. A huge psychological literature that shows us that just informing people of the threat is not enough. You have to pair that with a sense that, yes, in fact, we can make a difference. Okay, so to summarize, as I've described, public understanding of this issue really declined pretty substantially, especially from 2008 to 2010, is somewhat coming back today. That clearly changed the national political climate and has really changed the overall public discourse. Again, that there are these 6 very different Americas that need these different kinds of engagement strategies. The way that you would talk to a member of the alarmed or concerned is not the way that you should probably talk to a member of the disengaged, much less a member of the dismissive. Critically, that the facts are always being actively interpreted by these different audiences who are always constructing their own understanding in accordance with what they already know or think they know, their underlying values, and their emotions. Okay? This issue, for some people, has become a deeply emotional issue, and you're going to have to navigate that on occasion. Likewise, just the true understanding of what is at stake with this issue is a heavy emotional burden for many people to bear when you really come to grips with what this issue is and what it implies. That is partly what's going on. It's not just the facts. And to underscore that, knowledge is necessary, but it's insufficient. Emotions, values, ideology, and these broader social, political, and economic forces are all playing critical and sometimes more important roles in shaping how the public understands and responds to this issue. Okay. Last, we need to develop better strategies to convey some of these core principles. Now, I'm not asking climate scientists to become advocates. I think that's an individual decision that many scientists have to wrestle with themselves. However, there's an enormous amount of incredibly valuable work that scientists can do in their fundamental role of informing the public of what the risks are. Here's the realities of climate change. Here's how we know that it's real. Here's how we know that it's already having impact and is likely to have much worse impact in the future. And in fact, here's a whole science of the solutions themselves. Now, to the public, to policymakers, you need to wrestle with these basic scientific findings in conjunction with your underlying values to make decisions, social decisions. So while the science can't demand a particular set of policy responses, it can absolutely inform them. And there's an enormous amount of work yet that we can do just on that level. So one, that the consensus exists, that there are human consequences. This isn't just about polar bears, that people's own lives are involved here, including health. I didn't talk about this, but we know that many, many Americans do not understand that climate change is going to have impacts on human health. that there are these links to some kinds of extreme weather events, and then again, critically, that this problem is in fact solvable. If you're interested in learning more, we put all of our materials up on our website for free. We have a lot of different kinds of reports that look at this in very different ways. I don't have to cover here, but we did a study very much focused on climate literacy. What do people really understand about how the climate system works, as well as the causes, consequences, and solutions to climate change? So if you just look up Americans' knowledge of climate change, you'll find that report that breaks it down not just by adults, but also by teenagers as well across the country. But anyway, please come visit us if you'd like to learn more. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tony, for that outstanding presentation. Very much appreciated. We have a little bit of time for questions that have come in at UForum and through Twitter, and we will be continuing to monitor those for the remaining 20 minutes. So please, if you have questions, send them in. You can see instructions on your GoToWebinar interface. The first question we have is regarding the IPCC report. As most of you know, there is one coming out next week. Tony, you touched a little bit on how some past IPCC reports have affected the conversation. What's your sense of how this upcoming report might have an impact on the public conversation and on the policy conversation?
Yeah, I think that largely depends on us. So first of all, I would say that the IPCC reports have had a profound impact. I think as a institution of science, it's one of the great innovations of last century. It's an unbelievably enormous effort, and so something that has been accomplished again and again and again at such a massive scale with so many volunteers with such an incredibly small staff is really a remarkable testament to the scientific community, frankly, and I think we should recognize that. Also, I think these reports in the past have had, obviously, a tremendous effect. They've driven a fair amount of media coverage. They've also, and perhaps more importantly, greatly informed the political debate. Remember, it's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This has been required and requested by the governments of the world, and that's who these reports are primarily written for. And clearly, they've helped shape the international discussion, greatly advancing the international discussion and debate over how to respond, given the obvious fact that we have not yet really responded in a scale commensurate with the issue. So one, I think these events or these reports have had a tremendous impact. In terms of their impact on the public, it's been pretty much limited to what we would call earned media. In other words, newspapers and occasional television broadcasts that just report on the reports being released. There has not been much effort to actually proactively communicate the findings of these reports, and that's largely because the IPCC itself, as an institution, is this incredibly small group of folks. It's something on the order of 8 to 12 people, and it's just grown slightly. They now have a communications director. They didn't have one before. So it's really been up to the wider community to take the findings of the IPCC and to get them out in the circulation. And that's what I would say now is the real challenge for this community, is to use the IPCC report as, again, a teachable moment. The media, political leaders, and the public are going to pay attention to this issue because it's going to get a bit of attention over the next 18 months as these reports come out. People are suddenly going to be going, oh yeah, climate change, what about that? And that's going to encourage many of them to start asking these questions. And again, as I said, we need to do everything we can to more than meet them halfway to do that. And also recognizing that there are a number of efforts surrounding the IPCC this time to try to better communicate it. And so, Real Climate, the rapid response team that's been formed in recent years, and many other efforts that are happening around the country and, frankly, globally, are going to be working to try to get these findings, in a sense, deeper penetration into the broad society and policymaking circles. So I think this one has some real potential, but we will see.
All right. Next question. As you alluded to, you've been releasing state-by-state reports. Recently released a report on attitudes in Ohio. You mentioned the Texas report is coming up. Do you have a rough timeline yet for other state reports? Are you planning to survey all 50 states? And have you been surprised particularly by any of the results from any particular states?
Yeah. Actually, no. We're going to be releasing a report of Texas next week. We're going to do a couple city-level studies. We actually did a study in San Francisco and in Columbus, Ohio. And then that's as far as our current funding has allowed us to go. Though we in prior years had done surveys in Florida and in Alaska as well. Yeah, I mean, would I like to be able to do surveys in all the states? Absolutely. It's just a limit of resources. In terms of what has surprised me, I think I don't know if it's been a big surprise as much as that it validates what we see at the national scale, and that there are important differences across the country. California, clearly, as a state, is much more engaged with this issue than other states across the country. But also we're seeing in some of these key states like Colorado and Ohio, which obviously have important signposts of where the country goes. We see that in the fact that there are political swing states in presidential elections. Even in those states, we're finding a majority of Americans think that climate change is happening, that support all kinds of climate action, want more action by their state officials as well. So, while our federal system seems completely stuck in gridlock, and in some cases even going in reverse, it's important to remember that in the end, the real action is really taking place at the state and local level. Yes, we need international action. Yes, we need national policy. But even when those things are available, a lot of the actual implementation of climate change policy and action is going to happen at the state and local level, both on the mitigation side as well as the preparedness and adaptation side. So states are critical.
All right, that leads very nicely into the next question, which is, in fact, as you pointed out, a number of states are moving quickly and strongly on adaptation and impacts, and in fact, some of them might argue are ahead of the federal government. Do you see that the citizens of the states are largely the ones driving the policy, or is it more leaders, legislators driving and the citizens following?
Oh, that is such a great question. That's a great research question, and in fact, that's one of the research questions we're pursuing. So I don't think I have an answer to that yet. I think it's important to recognize, though, that this is a symbiotic relationship between the people and what their priorities are, what they want, and their elected officials, and recognizing that both of those two things are actually quite complicated, that the people themselves are multiple, and as I've shown with the Six Americas, they have very different viewpoints on this issue. Some of those members of the public are highly motivated to press for change, or alternatively to stop change, and so that plays a critical role. But likewise, elected officials are subject to their own set of influences and pressures. And public opinion is one critical piece, because in the end, you need the votes, you need to get elected. But at the same time, you need money, you need campaign contributions. You can be led around by recent press coverage, as well as the lobbying by your fellow legislators. So there's all kinds of other things that go into that relationship between constituents and their elected officials.
All right. The next question is a bit of a follow-up to that. Looking at the national level, similarly, do you think citizen concern is leading or lagging what legislators are doing, and, for example, EPA actions that are on the docket right now?
Yeah, there it's actually very encouraging to an extent that the American public is actually well ahead of their elected officials. In fact, we've seen this consistently for many years. Even though there's still, Americans are relatively split about even the reality and seriousness of climate change, nonetheless, you still see very strong majority support for a whole variety of climate and energy policies, including regulating carbon dioxide as a pollutant. I don't remember the exact numbers right now, but it's well over 60%. It's probably on the order of 65%. 66% of Americans currently support regulating carbon dioxide as a pollutant, which is the essence of the EPA's regulatory strategy. Now, that's going to change. As you begin to see the forces for and against start to really argue this out in the public square, of course, people are going to start reacting much more based on their political ideology, their political allegiances, and so on. So, those numbers are going to change. But as of right now, the wind is really at the back of those who want more action because, again, Americans, by and large, very strongly support the fundamental shift that needs to happen in this country, and that's a shift from the old, dirty energy system of the 18th and 19th centuries to the clean energy system of the 21st century. And they tell us this over and over and over again, that they want to make that transition. They don't expect it to happen overnight, but they do want us to get started. And there's actually strong permission for elected officials to do that. Then you come back and you look at the members of the current Congress, and in particular in the House of Representatives, and you just see that many of them are actually completely out of step with certainly that national mood. But one of the things we're interested in looking at is to what extent are they actually adequately or accurately representing the views of their specific district. Because if you come from a really conservative Tea Party type district, you're in a position where you're not going, not only are you not going to buck them, but you probably do represent their beliefs. And that's, structural to our form of representational government as of right now.
So if carbon dioxide were visible, the way we see this problem might be very different. Do you think there's room for art, video, some kind of visual representation of that to help move the needle on public opinion?
Absolutely. Yeah, now if I could do one thing, and this is to all those engineering and scientists out there, find a way to visualize carbon dioxide. Whether it's adding something to a carbon dioxide molecule that suddenly allows us to see it, whether it's developing a new kind of camera that allows us to actually see it in the air, I think it would be revolutionary if we could really see what's going on. Because at many scales, you would just suddenly recognize just how vast the amounts are that we're emitting. In the interim, there are many different efforts to try to represent that through the creative arts. Through computer generation as one way. Project Vulcan is trying to do it through modeling and other ways. But absolutely, this is one of those things that certainly the creative and artistic community can absolutely help. One is to make these things real for us, but secondly, to help us understand them through narrative and story, which is still the fundamental way that humans have to convey information effectively from one person to the next. As scientists, that's essentially what we are. We are storytellers. We tell very complex and technically jargon-filled stories to each other, but that's what we're doing. We're telling stories to each other. And likewise, we need to find better ways to tell the climate change story to our broader society. So absolutely, the creative arts, I think, wherever possible, need to be working with the scientific community to help tell those stories.
All right, we have a question from someone who says, I work with rural communities and find that they are mostly doubtful. What communications tactics do you recommend? What solutions, or what works best in that context? Yeah.
Again, these things will always come down to the very particular setting. But I think here's kind of our most simple formula that works everywhere. And, of course, it's not a formula, but it's at least a really helpful guideline. And that is that generally you want simple, clear, and compelling messages. Okay? Not all the complexities, or only as much complexity as the audience you're talking to wants and needs. Repeat it often, repeat it often, repeat it often, repeat it often, repeat it often. And I mean repeat it often because it's usually about the time that you are so sick of saying it again and again and again, that's probably the moment that they're actually starting to hear you for the first time. By a variety of trusted sources, and that really comes back to this question. Trust is absolutely critical. And yes, climate scientists as a group are the most trusted in America. It's an incredibly valuable advantage and resource that scientists have on this, that you are credible. That said, most people don't know you. They don't know you personally. It's not like most people have a climate scientist, that they can talk to over the fence in their backyard. In fact, it's even worse. There have been studies that have asked Americans to name a living scientist, and most can't. And the ones that most often get named are Einstein and Darwin. If only they were still alive. So, it's not through direct personal contact. And in the end, it's those personal relationships of trust that are, in the end, the most important. And so what I would suggest to anybody, including people working in rural communities, is really try to ally yourself, work with, empower, champion those people who are opinion leaders, thought leaders within their own communities to help their broader community to take this issue on. So farmers and extension agents, as an example, can often play a really valuable role because they already they live in the communities, they're already a trusted source of information, and many of them have the scientific background to understand what this issue potentially means for their community. Those are exactly the kinds of people we need to be working with.
All right, we have about 5 minutes left, and we have 2 more questions in the queue, so we'll try to zip through those. A little bit more on Sandy, Tony. Did it make a lasting difference in public opinion?
Great question. We don't actually really know the answer to that yet. The one survey I've seen suggests that it did have a significant impact. That said, again, I'll go back to my broader point about these disasters. These disasters don't just simply happen and that people suddenly go, okay, now I'm convinced and, I'm on board, let's go. Some people will have that kind of, very big conversion experience, but many people, especially in the wake of a disaster, are quite understandably totally focused on recovery and rehabilitation and rebuilding of their lives. And the first impulse for most people is, I want to rebuild my community back to what it was. The challenge is that, especially when we look at things like Sandy, and actually we just had a seminar with one of our U.S. senators, Senator Chris Murphy here at Yale, dedicated to how are we vulnerable in New England? How do we build more resilient communities in New England? This is a real challenge to, as we rebuild after these kinds of disasters, how do we rebuild in smarter ways that incorporate the risks of climate change, not only now, but in the future? Because if you're going to build a bridge, to what tolerances do you build that bridge? If you're going to rebuild along the seashore, what should you be preparing for? If you're going to rebuild after a flood, do you want to be using the old floodplain maps, or do you want to be incorporating up-to-date versions? And these are going to be really difficult decisions for many people. And again, the scientific community is going to play an absolutely critical role in giving people the information they need to make better decisions, long-term decisions. But it's going to be messy.
Well, certainly here in Colorado, we've seen some of the processes you're talking about in terms of the immediate response to disaster over the last several days. So,
absolutely. And sorry, thank you for even saying that. I should have started with how much my heart goes out to all my friends and colleagues out there in Boulder County and surrounding area. I mean, absolutely just stunning to hear the stories of what's happening there. So I hope you're all well.
We are getting there. We're working hard towards recovery. It's a long process. It will be a long and arduous process. We've never seen anything like this in this area, so quite a challenge. But thank you for that, and thank you so much for the presentation. It's been fantastic to get your incredibly informed and effective take on how we can get the climate message out and help people to understand what it is and why it matters. I'd like to, again, thank everyone for tuning in for this second UForum. Please watch for future installments. You can get to our UCAR Forum website by going to president.ucar.edu. That's UCAR, so president.ucar.edu. And if you also go to the main UCAR homepage, there should be a link on the right-hand side, so ucar.edu. We will also be archiving this presentation, hopefully in the very near future. So you can watch for that as well on the website. Again, thank you very, very much, Tony, for presenting, and thank you all for tuning in to UForum.
Thank you.